The whole of Clearwater Flats, Alberta knew what Gareth Dunmore was. The land registry knew. The town council knew. The RCMP detachment 30 miles east knew, and they cashed the goodwill he sent every Christmas in the form of whiskey cases and hunting permits, and the quiet understanding that some men in this province were simply above the paperwork. Every person who worked the feed stores and the diner and the one gas station with the broken second pump knew what happened inside the walls of the Dunmore property when the truck lights went off and the gate locked. They knew, and they looked at their boots, and they went home. Petra Vance had been 24 years old when she married him. She had come to Clearwater Flats from Red Deer, following a cousin who had since moved away, and she had met Gareth at a fall auction where he stood like he owned the earth beneath the tent, which he nearly did. He had been charming the way a cold front is charming. You feel it before you understand what it means. He was 51, twice divorced, and he introduced himself with the easy confidence of a man who had never once waited for anything. She had been lonely in the particular way that young women in unfamiliar towns are lonely, the kind that makes warmth feel like rescue. By the end of the first winter, she understood that she had not been rescued. She had not been chosen, she had been acquired. Gareth Dunmore understood control the way a man understands. A tool he has used his whole life, without thinking about it, without examining it, the way breathing is not examined. He controlled her money first, which was simple because she had very little. He opened the joint account and deposited her small wages from the admin position she'd held at the agricultural co-op. Then made it understood, not through argument but through consequence, that purchases required discussion. The discussion always ended the same way. She stopped having it. He controlled her friendships next, which took longer but was just as thorough. There was always a reason. This woman talked too much. That one had a husband with a drinking problem, and Gareth didn't want that energy in his house. The cousin who might have helped had already left for Vancouver. The women at the church auxiliary looked at Petra with a particular expression she came to recognize as rehearsed sympathy, the kind that costs nothing and changes nothing. He never struck her where it would show for a long time. He understood optics. He understood that a man of his standing needed the appearance of a good household. And Petra learned to maintain that appearance the way she learned everything in that marriage. Quietly, carefully, and at great personal cost. The second year was when she started keeping the money. It began with the change from grocery runs. Gareth gave her cash because he trusted cash more than cards. He could see exactly what was spent. But he rounded up, always. Because precision in small amounts felt beneath him. $11 here, $7 there. She began folding those bills small and keeping them in the lining of a winter boot in the closet. A boot he'd never worn and never looked at. A man like Gareth Dunmore not being the kind to rummage. By the end of 14 months, she had $460 and a knowledge of herself she hadn't expected. She was patient. She was more patient than she had ever imagined she could be. The money was not just money. The money was the part of herself she was keeping when everything else was being steadily taken. She did not have a plan. Not yet. She had only the boot, and the belief, pressed flat and kept carefully, that this was not where her life was going to end. Owen Cathcart came into Clearwater Flats in the second week of March, when the snowpack was still deep on the eastern ranges and the roads had that particular gray slickness that makes Alberta drivers quiet and focused. He drove a truck that had clearly done significant work in its life. Mud along the panels, a cracked side mirror replaced with a piece of mirror and electrical tape. Gear in the bed under a tarp. He was not from here, that was visible. But he carried himself without the self-consciousness of a stranger, the way men do when they have been strangers in enough places that it stopped bothering them. He took a room above the feed merchant's office. 3 days initially, which became a week, which became 3 weeks. He was doing route work for a small freight operation that serviced the ranches and outposts north of town, and he was methodical about it in a way that people noticed without being able to explain exactly why. He didn't talk much. He didn't fill silence the way some men do, compulsively, like they're afraid of what the quiet might say. He ate at the diner on Wednesday evenings and nodded at people he recognized from the week before. Petra saw him for the first time at Beaumont's Hardware, on a Tuesday in late March. She was there for weather stripping, which Gareth had told her to get 3 weeks ago and which she had been managing to delay through a series of small, legitimate excuses, because her time in town alone was the only time that was fully hers. She was standing in the fasteners aisle, trying to remember the exact measurement Gareth had written on the slip of paper she'd left on the kitchen counter, which she now realized was still on the kitchen counter, when a man came around the end of the aisle and reached past her for a box of roofing nails. He was tall, bearded in the way of someone who had stopped thinking about it rather than someone making a statement, and he wore a canvas work jacket with the collar turned up. He took the nails, glanced at her. She had gone still in that automatic way she'd developed, the way prey animals go, still. And then he looked at the shelf she was standing in front of and said, without preamble, "The gray roll is better for the temperature range up here. The black one gets brittle." She looked at the 2 rolls of weather stripping. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and moved on. It was a 12-second interaction. She thought about it for 3 days. Not because he was striking, though he was, in an uncomplicated outdoors way. Not because of anything he said, but because he had spoken to her like she was simply a person who might benefit from accurate information. Not like a possession of Gareth Dunmore's, not with the particular careful distance that the people of Clearwater Flats had adopted around her. Like she was simply present, and it was simply reasonable to talk to her. She had forgotten what that felt like. The incident at the diner happened on the first Friday of April. Gareth came in for the early lunch he sometimes did when his meetings with the municipal councillors ran short, and Petra was there because she had been running errands in town and had allowed herself 40 minutes she had not reported to him. She was sitting at the counter with a coffee, not doing anything wrong, not meeting anyone, simply sitting with a coffee and looking out the window at the street where the last gray snow was retreating from the curb. Gareth came through the door and saw her, and his face did the thing it did. A very small tightening around the jaw. A recalibration. He crossed her in the specific way he moved when he was managing his public presentation, and he put his hand on her shoulder in a way that looked companionable and was not. "Didn't know you'd be in town this long," he said, and his voice was pleasant. "I had the Friesen account to drop off," she said. "Then I was heading back." "Well," he squeezed her shoulder in a way that had a message in it. "Finish up." Owen Cathcart was in the booth behind her. She had not noticed him when she sat down, and she didn't know if he had been there long. She found out afterward that he had been there since 11:30, working through a plate of eggs and reading something on his phone. What happened was this: Gareth, satisfied that she would comply, turned to find a seat, and his elbow caught her coffee cup, which went over and soaked her sleeve. He looked at it. He looked at it. He looked at her. And he said in that same pleasant voice, "You should have pushed it further back on the counter." In the diner, nobody moved for a moment. And then, from the booth behind her, without any particular heat or aggression, Owen said, "She was sitting fine. Cup was fine." Gareth turned. He took Owen in with the assessing look of a man who has spent his life knowing exactly where he stands relative to everyone else. Owen was looking at him with the specific neutrality of someone who has no stake in making the other person feel comfortable or uncomfortable, simply looking. "Mind your business," Gareth said. "Having breakfast," Owen said. "Already in my business." There was a long moment. Petra was not breathing. Gareth Dunmore was not a man who could afford a scene in a public diner in a town where he had council connections. He understood, somewhere beneath his anger, that this particular man in this particular booth was not going to be moved by the social architecture that moved everyone else. There was no lever. Gareth looked for levers always, and he could not find one. He turned back to Petra. "I'll see you at home," he said, and he left. Petra sat with the wet sleeve and didn't move for almost a minute. Then she heard the booth behind her shift, and Owen put some bills on the counter and stood to leave. He paused beside her. "You all right?" he asked quietly. "Yes," she said, which was technically the smallest possible version of the truth. He nodded. He put on his jacket. At the door he stopped and said, without turning around, "Door on the northwest side of Beaumont's is never locked before 7 a.m., in case you ever need somewhere that isn't where you are." He left. She did not look at anyone in the diner. She picked up her bag and she went home. She thought about the northwest door for 11 days. During those 11 days, Gareth was worse in the ways he was always worse after a public moment that hadn't gone his way. Not violent in the visible way, Gareth rarely was visible, but present in a way that crowded every room, that made the kitchen feel smaller, that made her measure every word before she said it twice. She moved through the house like something that had learned to take up no space. The brute had $620 in it now. She had been careful. On the 12th day, a Wednesday, Gareth drove to Lethbridge for a 2-day meeting with a regional land consortium he'd been working toward for 3 years. He told her he'd be back Thursday evening. He told her to have the house in order. She waited until his truck was an hour gone. Then she went to the closet and she took the boot. She moved to the house with the particular focus of someone who has rehearsed something in their head so many times that the actual execution of it feels slightly unreal. She took her winter coat and the good pair of boots she'd bought herself 2 years ago before the account situation. She took her identification documents from the filing cabinet in the office, which Gareth kept locked, but the key to which lived on a hook behind the detergent under the sink. A hiding spot that had told her everything she needed to know about how much he feared her, which was not at all. She took her phone charger and a change of clothes and the photograph of her grandmother that had lived on the windowsill of every room she'd ever occupied. She did not take anything that was his. She did not leave a note. Notes could be used. Notes were sentences that could be taken apart. She drove into Clearwater Flats in Gareth's secondary truck, the one he rarely used, and she parked it in the municipal lot and left the keys on the seat. Then she walked to Beaumont's Hardware. The northwest door was unlocked. Owen was not there, but there was a note on the workbench inside that said, in plain handwriting, "Coffee on the main street." Blue jacket. No rush. She read it twice. She folded it and put it in her pocket. She found him at the coffee place on Mackenzie Street, the one that served the dark roast she'd been quietly preferring for 2 years without ever ordering it because Gareth considered dark roast an affectation. Owen was at a table by the window with 2 cups, like he'd simply been expecting her at some point, and the specific morning was a detail. She sat down. "He's gone until Thursday," she said. "I know," Owen said. "I saw him leave. I have $620 and my documents." "That's enough," he said. He said it like he meant it, not like reassurance. She picked up the dark roast. "I don't have a destination. There's a women's outreach in Red Deer that has a transition house," he said. "Decent staff. I can drive you as far as the junction. You can get the coach from there. Or I can drive you to Red Deer directly. Either way." She looked at him. "Why?" Owen was quiet for a moment. In the way she'd come to understand was not evasion, but actual thought. "Because nobody in this town did anything," he said. "And I was getting tired of being part of nobody." She drank her coffee. Outside the window, Clearwater Flats went about its morning the way it always had, slowly, quietly, in the particular way of small towns that have decided not to notice certain things. "He'll be angry," she said. "Yes," Owen said. "He has connections. The RCMP." "You haven't committed a crime," Owen said. "You left a house with your own belongings and your own documents. That's it. That's all this is." She knew that. She had known it technically for a long time. It was different to hear someone say it plainly. "He'll say I stole the truck." "You left the truck in a municipal lot with the keys in it." Owen's voice was even. "That's not theft. That's parking." Something shifted in her chest, something she could not name immediately. It took her another moment to recognize it as the specific sensation of a story being told accurately, maybe for the first time in 2 years. "Okay," she said. Owen drove her to Red Deer that same morning, the gray March fields opening up on either side of the highway, the mountains visible in the west at certain angles, white and unhurried. They didn't talk much. He put on the radio at a low volume, and she looked out the window and let herself be in the truck without managing anything, without calculating anything. It was such an unfamiliar sensation that for a while she confused it with anxiety because her body had forgotten the difference. An hour out, she said, without really planning to, "The weather stripping." Owen glanced over. "In the hardware store," she said. "You told me the gray was better." "It is," he said. "Better cold tolerance." "I never bought it," she said. "He's going to notice." "He's going to notice a lot more than the weather stripping," Owen said. She almost laughed. It came out strange, because her laughing muscles had not been used in the same way for a long time. But it was real. It was entirely real. The Red Deer transition house was a converted Victorian on a residential street, painted a color that tried very hard to be cheerful, and mostly succeeded. A woman named Sandra met them at the door, practical and warm in the specific combination that Petra would later understand was professional on purpose, because some situations require someone who is neither clinical nor overwhelming. Sandra shook Petra's hand and looked at her directly and said, "You made it today. That's the only thing that matters right now." Owen stayed at the door. He did not come inside. Petra turned to him before she went in. "Thank you," she said, which felt completely inadequate and completely necessary at the same time. "You did the work," he said. 2 years of work. I just drove." She looked at him for a moment. There was a version of this story in which she asked him for more, or needed him to be more. And she understood that version. She understood why a person would reach for the first person who had been genuinely kind, but she was 27 years old and she had just left a man who had made her small, and what she needed more than anything was to find out what size she actually was. "Maybe I'll see you," she said. "Maybe," he said, and the word had room in it. Not a promise. Not a door closed. Just room. She stayed at the transition house for 6 weeks. She found legal aid through the outreach program and began the process of documenting what had happened, carefully, with a woman named Andrea who explained each step before she took it, and never once implied that Petra should have left sooner. The process was slower than she wanted and cleaner than she expected. Gareth Dunmore made noise, as men like Gareth Dunmore do. He called through intermediaries. He had a lawyer send a letter. He told the story in Clearwater Flats the way such men always tell the story, positioning himself as the wronged party, the bewildered husband, the victim of ingratitude. None of it reached her directly. Sandra had explained early on the particular mechanics of that kind of noise, how it was designed to make a woman feel exposed and cornered, and how understanding it as a tactic rather than a truth changed its ability to land. Petra understood it as a tactic. She got a job at the reception desk of a physiotherapy clinic in Red Deer through a posting Sandra had flagged, and she turned out to be good at it in the quiet, methodical way she'd always been good at administration, the kind of competence that had never been noticed inside a marriage that required her to be incompetent. The staff were ordinary and kind. Her supervisor brought Timbits on Fridays. The patients had sore shoulders and bad knees, and they thanked her when she booked their follow-up appointments. And it was, she would later try to explain to Andrea, almost impossible to overstate how much that mattered. Being thanked for something small, without the ground moving under it. By the end of the 2nd month, she had found a basement apartment 3 blocks from the clinic. It was not large. The kitchen window looked at a fence. The heating made a noise at night that she eventually stopped hearing. She put her grandmother's photograph on the windowsill. She sat on the floor of the empty apartment the first night, back against the wall, looking at the space that was only hers, and she thought about the boot in the closet and the $460 that had been the first sentence of a story she was still in the middle of writing. The ending wasn't written yet. She was 27 years old and she was a woman who had gotten out, and that was not nothing. That was not close to nothing. That was, in fact, where the story changed. I keep thinking about the boot. Not the money inside it, though that mattered. $620 folded small and kept in the dark, built from spare change and patience and the quiet decision that some part of herself was not for sale. I keep thinking about what it took to start the boot in the first place. To look at $11 left over from groceries and think, I'm keeping this. Before there was a plan. Before there was an Owen or a Sandra or a transition house on a residential street in Red Deer. Before any of it. Just a woman alone in a closet making a choice that nobody would ever see. That's the part that stays with me. We talk about courage like it's a loud thing, like it announces itself. But what Petra did for 2 years before she left was quiet in a way that most people never see in stories like this. Because stories like this tend to start at the moment of escape. The running, the door, the truck pulling out of the municipal lot with the keys left on the seat. That part is visible. That part makes sense to us, because we can follow it. But the real work happened in the years before. In the decision to stay whole, inside a situation that was designed to make her smaller, to notice what was being taken and to refuse to let all of it go. To keep something back, even something as small as $11, because keeping it was an act of knowing that she was worth keeping. That takes a certain kind of honesty with yourself, not the easy kind. The kind that costs something, because it requires you to look clearly at what's happening when every pressure around you is telling you to look away, to explain it differently, to believe the version of events that makes staying feel reasonable. Petra didn't let herself fully believe that version. Some part of her held on to the truth, even when the truth was too heavy to carry openly. That's not nothing. That's actually the hardest thing. And Owen. I think about Owen too, and what it meant that he said something in that diner when everyone else had spent years saying nothing. He wasn't a hero in the way we usually mean it. He didn't arrive with a plan or a speech. He just refused to participate in the silence. 5 words from a booth, low and even, directed at a man who had never once been spoken to that way in that town. The thing about standing up quietly is that it asks something real of you. It asks you to accept the discomfort without knowing how it ends. Owen didn't know how Gareth was going to react. He just knew he was tired of being part of the room that looked at its boots. There's something in that for all of us. Not grand gestures. Not rescues. Just the daily choice to be a person who doesn't pretend not to see. Petra got out, because she had the patience to build toward it, the clarity to understand what was happening to her, and the steadiness to take one careful step at a time when the ground was never solid. Those 3 things together, the moral backbone, the clear-eyed thinking, the endurance that doesn't ask for applause. That's what survival actually looks like from the inside. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just a woman, a boot, and a grandmother's photograph on a windowsill in a basement apartment that was only hers. That's where the story changes. That's always where the story changes.